Most people assume that throughout history, farmers chose crops for one primary reason: yield, calories per acre, efficiency, feeding the most people with the least land. That assumption feels logical, especially when we talk about wartime shortages and survival. But, when you look closely at how people actually chose what to plant during periods of conflict, invasion, and political instability, a different logic appears. Again and again, crop choice reflected fear more than productivity. Fear of soldiers, fear of requisition, fear of fire, fear of displacement, and honestly, fear of tomorrow being nothing like today. This matters because food production is often treated as a neutral backdrop to war, when in reality, it was one of the most sensitive indicators of how people understood risk. Crops were not just food, they were bets placed months in advance under conditions of deep uncertainty. And those bets reveal how civilians experienced war long before armies arrived. What follows is not a story about battlefields. It is about fields that were quietly reshaped by threat, and about decisions that prioritize survival under violence rather than maximum output under peace. Before war reached the battlefield, it reached the soil through anticipation and rumor. In much of pre-industrial and early industrial Europe, the crops planted in a given year already reflected expectations of disorder. Farmers paid close attention to troop movements, tax collectors, requisition patterns, and rumors of mobilization. These signals often mattered more than soil quality or market prices. High-yield cereal crops like wheat were valuable but, also quite vulnerable. They required longer growing seasons, careful harvesting, centralized storage, and, predictable labor. In contrast, lower-yield crops such as rye, barley, oats, turnips, and potatoes offered something more important during unstable times: flexibility. These could be harvested early, eaten incrementally, hidden in the ground, or even consumed before an army could seize them. In regions that experienced repeated invasions such as eastern France, the Low Countries, Poland, and the western borderlands of the Russian Empire, crop selection shifted noticeably in anticipation of conflict. This was not because farmers misunderstood yield. It was because they quite wisely understood risk. A field of wheat represented months of exposed investment, but a patchwork of mixed crops, that represented options. Root crops became tools of concealment as much as sources of nutrition. One of the most overlooked adaptations in wartime agriculture was, honestly, the strategic use of root crops. Potatoes, turnips, and beets produced fewer calories per labor hour than some grains, but, they had a crucial advantage. They stayed hidden underground. An advancing army could burn fields, trample crops, and seize barns, but root crops could be harvested selectively, sometimes at night, sometimes only as needed. Entire harvests could remain invisible to passing forces. This made them especially valuable in regions subjected to foraging armies, whether Napoleonic troops, imperial garrisons, or irregular militias. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, military planners increasingly recognized this pattern. Reports from occupied territories during World War I noted that civilian populations often survived not on officially rationed bread, but on unofficial root crops grown in marginal plots, gardens, and forest edges. These crops rarely appeared in requisition records precisely because they were difficult to quantify and seize. From a survival perspective, concealment actually mattered more than abundance. A smaller harvest that could be protected was preferable to a larger one that could be taken. In many conflicts, the primary threat to civilian food supply was not enemy soldiers, but, surprisingly, one's own government. states at war relied heavily on grain requisition, forced sales, and price controls. These policies, well, they targeted crops that were standardized, transportable, and easy to measure. Wheat and maize were ideal for state extraction. Rye and mixed grains, though, were less so. In some regions, farmers deliberately shifted away from crops that fit neatly into state accounting systems. This was not resistance in a political sense. It was really just a rational attempt to retain control over one's own food. During the First World War, this dynamic was visible across Central and Eastern Europe. Official statistics suggested stable or even rising production in some areas, while local hunger worsened. The discrepancy existed because production shifted toward crops that never entered official channels. What looked like inefficiency from the state's perspective was, in fact, efficiency from the household's perspective. Crop choice became a way to opt out, partially and quietly, from total mobilization. Long-maturing crops assume stability. They assume that the farmer will still be present at harvest time, that fields will not be abandoned, and that labor will not be disrupted. War, however, undermines all of these assumptions. As a result, farmers under threat favored crops with shorter growing cycles, even if yields were lower. Early barley, oats, and certain legumes could be harvested before campaigns reached full intensity. In some regions, this meant deliberately accepting smaller harvests in exchange for certainty. This logic became especially pronounced during conflicts involving mass displacement. In areas prone to evacuation or forced relocation, planting long-term crops made little sense. Fields were treated as temporary assets, not permanent investments. The agricultural landscape thus mirrored the psychological landscape. People planted for the world they expected, not the one they hoped for. Livestock feed choices reveal the same fear-driven logic. Crop choice was not only about human consumption, it also shaped the survival of livestock, which, were both assets and liabilities during war. Animals could be seized, but they could also convert otherwise inedible crops into food. Farmers increasingly favored feed crops that could be grown quickly and in small plots, even if they produced less total fodder. This allowed them to maintain minimal livestock without advertising wealth or surplus. In some cases, animals were kept alive primarily as mobile food reserves rather than productive assets. This shift had long-term consequences. Post-war recovery was often slowed not by lack of land or labor, but by the collapse of breeding stock. Short-term survival decisions, they reshaped agricultural systems for decades. By the middle of the 20th century, military planners began to realize that civilian agriculture, when under threat, just didn't behave in predictable ways. High-yield models, often failed when territories were under occupation, and efforts to extract surplus frequently backfired, actually driving production underground or into forms that were much less visible. This realization in turn influenced later counterinsurgency doctrine, food security planning, and even occupation policy. Control over territory, it turned out, just did not guarantee control over calories. The civilian response to fear proved really much more adaptive than centralized planning had anticipated. For survivalists and students of resilience, this lesson is still relevant today. Systems that are optimized for efficiency under stable conditions, they often collapse when they're put under stress. But, systems designed for concealment, redundancy, and flexibility, they're the ones that tend to endure. The overlooked lesson is that fear reshapes rationality rather than replacing it. It is tempting to describe fear-driven decisions as irrational, but the historical record shows the opposite. Farmers made calculated choices based on credible threats. They sacrificed potential yield to reduce exposure. They traded surplus for autonomy. These decisions were not about panic, they were about probabilities. Understanding this helps explain why famine and scarcity so often occurred alongside unused land and unharvested potential. The limiting factor was not agricultural knowledge, it was trust in the future. Remembering these choices matters because they reveal how civilians actually survived war. Wars are often remembered through strategies, leaders, and battles. But, survival happened quietly in fields planted differently because someone expected trouble. Crop choice became a form of risk management long before the term existed. By paying attention to these overlooked decisions, we gain a clearer understanding of how societies endure prolonged instability, not by maximizing output, but by minimizing vulnerability. If you value history that looks beyond the obvious and takes civilian survival seriously, consider subscribing to Iron Age Instincts and sharing this video. These are the details that change how we understand the past and how we prepare for uncertainty in the future.